He didn't know he had minutes left to live. The most powerful man in Rome, the man who conquered nations, crushed republics, rewrote laws, and bent a civilization to his will, was about to walk into a room filled with smiling faces, hiding knives. And the most terrifying part, he trusted almost every one of them. Julius Caesar, the dictator of Rome, the man who took the throne of an entire world, was about to pay for it not with exile, not with humiliation, but with 23 stab wounds, each one delivered by men who pretended they loved the Republic more than they loved him. But what they really loved was their own power. When Caesar stepped out on that cold March morning, Rome felt tense, like the air itself was holding its breath. Whispers moved through the streets faster than the wind across the Tiber. Caesar had just been offered another lifetime dictatorship. Statues of him were rising like he was a living god. The Senate pretended to approve, but inside their marble halls, they panicked. A man like Caesar doesn't just rule a nation. He reshapes reality and the men who sat beneath him. The senators, the aristocrats, the noble families were terrified of a future where they were nothing more than decorations in Caesar's empire. They told themselves they were defending democracy. They told themselves that the Republic needed saving. But the truth was uglier. They didn't want to save Rome. They wanted to save themselves from Caesar's unstoppable rise, because Caesar had done the impossible. He crushed the Senate's armies. He crossed the Rubicon, a crime punishable by death, and instead of being punished, he became master of Rome. He took the throne without ever calling himself king. He made himself essential, untouchable, unstoppable, and the people loved him for it. Bread, debt relief, entertainment, public festivals, land. Caesar gave the masses everything the Senate had refused for centuries. For the first time, ordinary Romans saw a leader who didn't just talk about change, he delivered it. And when the people love you more than they love the old system starts sharpening its knives. On the Ides of March, the Senate invited Caesar to a meeting. Urgent matters of state, they said. But behind the scenes, dozens of men were preparing to commit the most famous political murder in human history. Some were cowards hiding behind ideals. Some were jealous of Caesar's glory. Some were genuinely convinced it was the only way to stop Rome from becoming a monarchy. And one was like a son to him, Marcus Brutus. Caesar trusted him. He protected him. He lifted him up in Roman politics, gave him prestige, gave him influence, gave him everything a rising noble could ever dream of. And Brutus sharpened the knife that would plunge into Caesar's flesh. As Caesar entered the theater of Pompey, ironically a building named after the man Caesar defeated in civil war, a storm was gathering. Men who had smiled at him the day before were positioning themselves around him. They weren't warriors. They weren't soldiers. They were politicians armed with daggers, trembling, sweating, terrified of failure, and equally terrified of success. Because once the first blade went in, there was no going back. Rome would never be the same. The Republic would shatter. The world would change forever. But in those final moments, Caesar did not know. He believed he controlled everything. He believed his power was secure. He believed the Senate obeyed him because they respected him. He didn't understand, or maybe he understood too late, that people will always forgive a ruler who is kind, a ruler who is strong, a ruler who is just. But they will never forgive a ruler who reminds them how small they truly are. And Julius Caesar made every senator in Rome feel small. As he took his seat, the conspirators closed in. A hand reached out, pulling at his toga, the signal. Dozens of men moved at once. Steel flashed. Caesar stood confused. The first stab hit him in the neck. He turned, shocked, betrayed, furious. Then he saw Brutus, and history became legend. Before he became the most feared man in Rome, Julius Caesar was nobody special. A skinny, sharp-eyed teenager from an old but not-so-powerful family. A boy with a famous name, Caesar, but almost no actual power to go with it. But what he did have was ambition. Ridiculous, volcanic ambition. The kind that keeps a person awake at night. The kind that doesn't care about rules or tradition, or what Rome expects from you. He was born into a world where political power sat in the hands of a few arrogant nobles, the optimate senators, who believed the republic existed for them and only them. These men controlled everything: wealth, military, religion, and the laws that kept regular Romans poor and obedient. Caesar saw it for what it was, a polite prison, and he had no intention of living in a cage. As a teenager, his life took a brutal turn. Sulla, Rome's dictator at the time, launched a purge: executions, exiles, confiscations. Anyone connected to his enemies was targeted. Caesar's family was on the wrong side. Soldiers arrived at his door. They demanded he divorce his wife, Cornelia, because she was the daughter of a political enemy. Caesar refused. And refusing a dictator in Rome was basically the same as signing your own death sentence. He went into hiding. He moved from house to house. He survived on favors, bribes, and pure luck. For a young noble, this was humiliation. For Caesar, it was education. He was learning how unpredictable power really was, how fragile the elite could become when someone stronger rose above them, how fear could control an entire city. Eventually, Sulla relented and spared him, but not because he liked Caesar. He reportedly said, "There are many Mariuses in that boy." Translation: "This kid is dangerous." And he was right. To escape the political chaos, Caesar joined the army. And this is where he discovered his true weapon. He wasn't a natural politician. He wasn't a traditional aristocrat. But on the battlefield, he was a phenomenon, brave in a way that didn't make sense, ruthless when necessary, charismatic enough to make hardened soldiers follow him without question. He fought in Asia Minor, saved a commander's life in battle, and earned the civic crown, one of Rome's highest honors. The soldiers loved him for his courage. The officers respected him for his intelligence. And Caesar realized something the Senate would spend decades trying and failing to understand. Armies give you power. Popularity gives you protection. But loyalty gives you immortality. After his military service, he traveled to Rhodes to study public speaking. Yes, Julius Caesar, the greatest commander of Rome, once spent his time practicing voice projection and hand gestures like an obsessed theater student. But his journey took a dramatic detour. His ship was captured by pirates. Normal Roman nobles would cry, bargain, or panic. Caesar didn't. He treated the pirates like annoying roommates. He demanded they raise his ransom because he was worth more than that. He lectured them. He joked with them. He casually told them that once he was free, he'd return to kill them all. They laughed. Until Caesar did exactly that. He raised a fleet, hunted the pirates down, captured them, and had them all crucified. Not because he hated them, because he promised he would. And Caesar kept his promises, especially the violent ones. After this, Rome saw him differently. He wasn't just a noble anymore. He was a force. When he returned to the capital, he climbed the political ladder shockingly fast. Money helped. Bribes helped. Popularity helped. But what really pushed him upward was something Rome had never seen before. A politician who understood how to perform. Caesar spoke like a hero from myth. He dressed elegantly. He appeared generous, charming, approachable. He threw massive games and festivals, drowning the city in entertainment. While the Senate debated, Caesar acted. He made himself impossible to ignore and even harder to stop. Soon his ambition collided with two names that would change history. Pompey the Great, the most successful general of the previous generation, and Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Together they formed the first triumvirate, a secret alliance that controlled every decision of the Republic. But here's the twist. Pompey wanted military glory. Crassus wanted wealth. The Senate wanted stability. Only Caesar wanted everything. And the world had no idea how much everything he intended to take. When Caesar became governor of Gaul, he was supposed to behave. Keep things quiet, manage taxes, maintain order, be a nice, boring Roman official. Instead, he looked at Gaul, a massive, wild land filled with warring tribes, and saw the perfect playground for someone who dreamed of becoming unstoppable. This was where Caesar would transform himself from a popular politician into the most dangerous man the Senate had ever unleashed. He didn't just want victories. He wanted epic, history-shattering triumphs the world would never forget. Gaul was about to become his masterpiece, painted in blood. His first opportunity arrived almost immediately. One Gallic tribe begged him for protection. Another was invading their territory. The politics were complicated, but Caesar didn't care. He cared about one thing: a legal excuse to start a war. He marched his legions north, wearing his signature red cloak, the same cloak he would become infamous for, and he launched a campaign that was so explosive, so ruthless, and so perfectly timed that even Rome gasped. Caesar wasn't just fighting battles. He was filming an ancient action movie in real time and narrating it himself. Every victory he wrote about in his famous commentaries, every detail, carefully edited, every speech, polished like a campaign ad, every heroic moment, choreographed for the Roman public. He wasn't just winning wars. He was building a brand. His strategy was terrifyingly simple. Move faster than anyone, hit harder than anyone, make sure the world hears about it. But behind the legend were tactics so brutal, even other Romans whispered about him. He burned villages. He slaughtered enemies who surrendered. He punished entire tribes for resisting. And the Senate. They pretended not to notice, because Caesar's victories made Rome rich. Loot poured into the capital. Gold, slaves, resources, it all kept the elite quiet. As long as Caesar kept winning, he was useful. But their fear grew with every new triumph. The Gallic tribes soon realized that if they didn't unite, Caesar would wipe them off the map one by one. So a charismatic leader named Vercingetorix emerged. Towering, fierce, dressed like a warrior king straight out of a fantasy movie. He united the tribes. He created a resistance, and he forced Caesar into the hardest war of his life. This clash wasn't just Rome versus Gaul. It was ambition versus desperation, a rising god versus a defending nation. At the Battle of Gergovia, Caesar tasted something he wasn't used to: defeat. His troops were pushed back. His legions suffered. The Gauls cheered. For once, Julius Caesar was vulnerable. But he bounced back with the fury of a man who absolutely refused to be anything less than legendary. He made a vow, silent but volcanic, that he would crush Vercingetorix and end the war in a single unforgettable moment. That moment came at Alesia. The battle was pure insanity. Vercingetorix fortified himself inside a massive hilltop stronghold. Caesar looked at the impossible fortress and basically said, "Cool, I'll just build a bigger one around yours." So he encircled Alesia with walls, miles and miles of them. Then he built a second set of walls facing outward, because another massive Gallic army was marching in to save Vercingetorix. Caesar was trapped between two enemies, outnumbered, cut off, starving, Any normal commander would panic. Caesar thrived. For days the battlefield was chaos. Shouting, smoke, dust, screaming, clashing steel, volleys of spears. But his discipline didn't crack. His lines didn't break. And when the final attack collapsed, Vercingetorix walked out of Alesia, surrendered his sword and dropped to his knees. It was one of the most dramatic scenes in ancient history. Rome lost its mind celebrating. Caesar's popularity skyrocketed, like he'd just won an ancient season finale of a Netflix war epic. But one group wasn't celebrating. The Senate. They saw the truth. Caesar didn't just conquer Gaul. He created an army that worshipped him. He printed his own fame. He became wealthier than the Republic itself. He wasn't a politician anymore. He was a thunderstorm. And the men in Rome, Pompey, the Senate, the old aristocrats, realized something too late. They hadn't created a hero. They'd created a king. And kings don't share power. Caesar returned from Gaul not like a general, but like a living earthquake. He came back with the loyalty of 50,000 battle-hardened soldiers, mountains of loot, and a reputation so massive that Rome couldn't fit him anymore. The senators sensed it. The aristocrats sensed it. And most of all, Pompey the Great, Caesar's former ally, definitely sensed it. Their partnership used to be a political love story. Two powerful men, one unstoppable alliance. They ruled Rome together under the first triumvirate. But that was before Caesar became, well, Caesar. Before he conquered Gaul. Before his name turned into a thunderclap. And Pompey? He liked being the top dog. He liked being the hero of Rome. So when Caesar started getting fan mail from across the Republic, and people began murmuring things like, "He's greater than Pompey ever was," Pompey didn't take it well. Their bromance shattered faster than an ancient clay amphora hitting marble. Now Rome found itself split into two camps. Team Caesar, veterans who would die for him, commoners who adored him, politicians who owed him favors, everyone who enjoyed the gold he kept flooding into the economy. Team Pompey, senators terrified of Caesar's power, aristocrats clutching their pearls, Roman elites who hated Caesar's popularity, basically everyone who feared becoming irrelevant. Tension built like a pot about to explode, and finally it happened. The Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome alone. No soldiers, no bodyguards, no power, just Caesar defenseless, ready to be arrested the moment he arrived. It wasn't a command. It was a threat wearing a toga. Caesar read the letter. He knew exactly what it meant. If he walked into Rome unarmed, he wouldn't walk out. His advisors panicked. His officers whispered in the corners. "What are we going to do?" Caesar stood there for a long moment, quiet, thinking. Then he looked up and gave an order that changed the destiny of Western civilization. "We march. The Rubicon River, a small, unimpressive stream between Gaul and Italy. But crossing it with an army, that was illegal. That was treason. That was declaring war on the Roman Senate itself. It was the ancient world's no-going-back button. Caesar arrived at the river at night. The water flowed quietly in the dark, like it was whispering. "If you cross, everything burns." His generals hesitated. One begged him, "Please don't do this. This is civil war." Caesar paced along the banks, torn between destiny and doom. Then he stopped, looked at his men, and spoke the most dangerous line of his life. "The die is cast." He rode forward. His soldiers followed. They crossed the Rubicon. Rome had just been broken in half. The moment news reached the city, panic hit like a plague. Pompey. He didn't stay and fight. He fled. He evacuated the Senate, the treasury, the elites, everyone who feared Caesar. and escaped to Greece. The most powerful man in Rome ran away in the night, chased by the ghost of Caesar's ambition. Meanwhile, Caesar strolled into Italy, and something surreal happened. He didn't face resistance. He didn't meet armies. Cities opened their gates. People cheered. Entire legions switched sides. It wasn't a march, it was a parade. Caesar wasn't conquering Rome. Rome was welcoming him home. Pompey realized he was fighting a man who didn't just have soldiers, he had the people. And in ancient politics, that was even scarier. This was the beginning of the Roman Civil War, a conflict that would kill an entire generation, destroy the Republic and replace it with emperors. And at the center of it all, one man with unmatched ambition, one man who refused to bow, one man who had crossed a little river and rewritten destiny. Caesar was no longer just a politician. He was a force. He was a storm. He was the man marching toward ultimate power. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he didn't just start a war. He triggered the greatest political meltdown in Roman history. The Senate had never been more confused in its life. Half of them screamed, "Caesar is a traitor." The other half whispered, "Honestly, Pompey kind of started this." But Pompey wasn't sticking around for debate. Rome's greatest general packed his bags, grabbed the Senate, scooped up the state treasury like someone running from debt collectors, and sprinted across the Adriatic Sea to Greece. His plan? Raise an army, crush Caesar, restore the Republic. Simple, except for one tiny detail. Caesar was already coming for him. The world chooses sides. The Roman Republic split like a cracked marble statue. Pompey's side had senators, aristocrats, rich landowners, international allies. The legal claim to power, basically the old guard. Caesar's side had loyal veteran soldiers, the poor, the middle class, half the cities in Italy, a bottomless bag of charisma. Basically, the people. It was tradition versus popularity, elite power versus mass support, old Rome versus new Rome. And history shows us something chilling. When a population truly loves their leader, tradition doesn't stand a chance. The chase begins. Caesar moved fast, like superhuman fast. He stormed into Italy so quickly that city after city surrendered as if competing over who could hand him the keys first. Meanwhile, Pompey kept withdrawing, constantly telling the Senate, "Totally fine. This is strategic. We're gathering forces. We're not running." As I promise, when Caesar reached Brundisium, Pompey barely escaped in a ship, leaving his men scrambling on the docks like passengers who missed their flight. Caesar arrived seconds too late. Pompey was gone. The real war would begin in Greece. Caesar takes the road trip from hell. But before chasing Pompey across the sea, Caesar needed supplies. Italy was loyal but drained, so he dashed to Spain. Why? Pompey still had several elite legions stationed there, and those legions absolutely did not want to be fighting Caesar. Why? Because they remembered Gaul, and Gaul remembered them. Caesar marched like a demon. In less than a year, he conquered Spain, flipped the legions, and strengthened his army. Then he turned east. Pompey was waiting. Pompey's super army. By the time Caesar sailed to Greece, Pompey had assembled 7 full Roman legions, 600 warships, thousands of archers and cavalry, kings and regional allies from the east, enough money to fund a small planet. It was the biggest army Rome had seen in decades. The Senate regained confidence. They strutted around like, "Oh yeah, victory is guaranteed. We're the good guys. Caesar is finished. They even started arguing over who would get which government position after Caesar was defeated. Some picked out their future villas in advance. Spoiler: they wouldn't use them. Caesar arrives and it's a disaster. Caesar crossed the sea with a tiny force, nowhere near the size of Pompey's. Then the storms hit. Supplies scattered. Ships sank. Thousands of reinforcements were stuck on the wrong side of the Adriatic. Caesar landed in Greece horribly outnumbered. Pompey's generals bragged, "Caesar is trapped. Make the grave big enough for his pride." The Senate relaxed. They held feasts. They toasted to victory. But Pompey wasn't celebrating. He knew Caesar better than anyone. And he said the line that made his generals go silent: "Do not underestimate a man who has marched on Rome." The Hunger Games Greece edition. Caesar's army was starving, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, cut off from supplies. Pompey cornered them against the coast. This should have been the end. Any other general would have surrendered. But Caesar wasn't any other general. He decided to do something absolutely insane: build fortifications around Pompey's army. Not attack, not retreat. He tried to trap the larger army inside a wall. It was military madness, but genius madness. Pompey could only watch as Caesar's men, half-starving and exhausted, began digging trenches and building walls in the blazing sun like possessed construction workers. For weeks they battled in a strange, nightmarish cat-and-mouse game of walls, counter-walls, surprise attacks, and near misses. Caesar was bleeding men. Pompey was bleeding time. And both armies knew the showdown was coming. The final blow before the final blow. Just when Caesar's situation looked hopeless, reinforcements arrived. The men trapped by storms months earlier finally broke through enemy naval blockades and landed safely. Caesar's army surged with new strength. Pompey realized this was his chance, his last best chance to crush Caesar before he became unstoppable. So he gathered his armies, lined them up, and prepared for a battle that would decide the fate of the world. That battle would happen at Pharsalus, the moment that would crown Caesar or kill him. The morning of the Battle of Pharsalus looked strangely peaceful. Clear skies, soft wind. Birds chirping like the universe had no idea two superpowers were about to tear each other apart. Pompey stood on high ground, his army spread wide and deep, a textbook perfect formation. He had the numbers, the cavalry, the archers, the position. Everything pointed to a guaranteed victory. Behind him, the senators, wearing armor for the first time in their lives, were already talking about how they would punish Caesar's traitors. Some were arguing over who would keep Caesar's house. One even asked where he could stand to get the best view of the battle. And down below, Caesar was doing what Caesar did best, looking terrifyingly calm. Caesar's tiny line and his secret plan. Caesar formed his men into an unusually thin line, stretched far too wide for comfort. It looked like a formation that wanted to lose. His officers were confused. His soldiers were confused. Even Pompey's men stared like, is he out of his mind? But Caesar wasn't planning to win with numbers. He was planning to win with brains. He had built a hidden fourth line, an extra layer of infantry tucked behind his cavalry, men ordered to do something no Roman soldier was ever trained to do: stab upward at the faces of charging horsemen. It was brutal, unexpected, and exactly the kind of trick Caesar loved. The Pompey makes the first move. Pompey signaled his cavalry to swing around Caesar's right flank. This was the moment everyone expected would end the war. Pompey had twice as many horsemen, and they were placed under one of the best cavalry commanders in Rome. The plan: crush Caesar's cavalry, attack from behind, wipe out the legions like stepping on a sandcastle. Caesar watched it unfold as casually as a man observing street traffic. The cavalry collision. Pompey's cavalry thundered forward, kicking clouds of dust into the sky. Caesar's cavalry pushed back, but quickly began to collapse. They weren't losing. They were pretending to lose. They slowly retreated inch by inch, drawing Pompey's horsemen further and further forward, until Pompey's cavalry outran their own infantry and ended up isolated on open ground. That's when Caesar gave the order. His hidden fourth line stood up, and the world learned a horrifying new lesson. Roman infantry stabbing upward into the faces of charging horsemen is one of history's most effective ways to break cavalry. Horses screamed. Men fell. Shields went up too late. Pompey's proud cavalry crumbled in minutes. Minutes. The moment everything collapsed, Pompey watched his unstoppable cavalry get wiped off the field like dust on a table. That was the moment. He realized he had lost. He turned pale. He whispered, "We are defeated," walked back into his command tent, and sat down silently, as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. Out on the battlefield, Caesar now unleashed the full force of his army. His infantry surged forward. The lines clashed. Pompey's men fought bravely, but Caesar's veterans were fighting like lions who'd been poked one too many times. And soon, Pompey's legions began to break. One by one, unit by unit, the great army of the Senate dissolved into a stampede of fleeing soldiers. Caesar had done the impossible. He defeated a bigger, richer, better-positioned army using discipline, deception, and sheer battlefield genius. The aftermath of a shattered army. Pompey didn't stay to watch the collapse. He rode off before the dust even settled. The senators who dreamed of glory tripped over each other to escape. Those fancy helmets they bought for the big victory, now rolling around in dirt as they sprinted away. Caesar didn't chase. He didn't celebrate. He didn't boast. He simply stood there watching the battlefield, knowing one thing. The Republic, as everyone knew it, was dead. But the war was not over. He still had to catch Pompey, the last symbol of resistance. The ghost of Pompey. Pompey fled across the Mediterranean to Egypt, believing he could find allies there. He was wrong, because Egypt at that moment was ruled by a paranoid regency, a teenage king, and a civil war between brother and sister, and they had no intention of hosting Rome's most wanted man. The stage was set for a betrayal that would shock Caesar and change the course of the ancient world. By the time the Senate gathered on the Ides of March, the air in Rome had turned poisonous, not literally, but close enough. Everyone could feel something was off, something electric, something wrong. Caesar woke up that morning in a strange mood. Suetonius writes that he felt uneasy, almost heavy. Calpurnia had dreamed of his statue bleeding, of Romans washing their hands in it. She begged him not to go. The sky outside looked dull, grey, unfriendly, as if the gods themselves weren't entirely sure who they supported anymore. Then Decimus Brutus, his friend, his drinking buddy, his loyal general, walked in with the calmest voice in Rome and convinced Caesar to ignore everything: the dreams, the omens, the warnings, the rumors. "The Senate is waiting," he said. "They plan to honor you." Honor him, right? So Caesar stepped into the streets. No guards, no legions, just a handful of attendants and a mountain of confidence. Because honestly, why would he fear danger? He had spent his entire life walking into traps and coming out stronger. He had crossed rival generals, kings, pirates, senators, and even the gods themselves, and won. What could a few politicians do? The theatre of Pompey was crowded when he arrived. Senators lined the walkway, heads bowed respectfully, but not too respectfully. They looked nervous in that overly polite way that only guilty people do. The conspirators had already spread out, forming what looked like a welcoming circle, but was actually a kill box. Caesar walked into the heart of it, and then everything collapsed. It started with Tullius Cimber, who grabbed Caesar's toga too aggressively, supposedly to beg for his brother's pardon. Caesar tried to brush him off, but the man held on, hard. Then came the first stab. Casca, the least courageous of them all, swung his dagger into Caesar's neck. Badly. Caesar jerked away, confused, shocked, and managed to shout the famous line historians still argue about. "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" And that was it. The conspirators struck from every angle. 20 men, 20 daggers. A frenzy of arms, cloth, and blade. Senators tripping over each other, stabbing each other by accident, slipping on blood pooling at their feet. This wasn't an execution. It was a panic attack with knives. The Roman Republic, that noble system built on checks, balances, and shared power, ended right there, in a frantic dogpile of terrified aristocrats. They didn't even kill Caesar cleanly, they butchered him, stab after stab after stab, because despite all their speeches about restoring liberty, every man wanted to make sure nobody could say later, "You didn't take part." They needed the guilt to be equal, or none of them would survive the aftermath. And then came Brutus, the man Caesar trusted like a son, the man he defended, promoted, protected. When Caesar saw him step forward with a dagger of his own, the world stopped. Not the stabbing, not the noise, not the collapse of his body, but the betrayal. That hit deeper than any blade. We don't know if he actually said "Et tu, Brute." We don't know if he said anything at all. But we know this. For the first time in his career, Julius Caesar gave up. He pulled his toga over his head, not out of fear, but out of dignity, and let himself fall at the foot of Pompey's statue, his old rival. The symbolism? Perfect. A man killed by the Senate, exactly where the Senate had celebrated killing Pompey. 23 wounds, only one was fatal. The rest? Panic, chaos, insecurity, everything the conspirators claimed Caesar represented but actually reflected them. And after the stabbing, the Senate didn't cheer. Rome didn't rejoice. The liberators didn't get applause or flowers or praise. They got silence. A silence so thick and awful that some of them ran out of the building screaming, covered in blood, shaking like men who suddenly realized they had just ended the world they were trying to save. Because at that moment, with Caesar's body cooling on the marble floor, one thing became brutally clear. They didn't save the Republic. They just murdered its only remaining control mechanism. And Rome was now a loaded weapon with no safety. The conspirators expected fireworks, cheering crowds, senators lifting them on their shoulders, Rome breaking into applause because the tyrant had finally been removed. They expected freedom. What they got was panic. The moment Caesar's body hit the floor, the men who killed him suddenly remembered something terrifying. Caesar had an entire army of loyal veterans living right outside the city, men who worshipped him, men who would burn the world for him. So these brave defenders of liberty did what any brave defender of liberty would do. They ran. Some fled out the back door. Others sprinted home and locked their doors. A few literally hid on rooftops until sunset. The Senate didn't resume business. The people didn't celebrate. The Forum didn't erupt in patriotic joy. Instead, Rome froze in horror. Because if the most powerful man in the world could be stabbed to death inside the Senate, surrounded by his own colleagues, then nobody was safe. Not senators, not generals, not shopkeepers, not farmers. It wasn't a triumph. It was a message. Rome had become kill or be killed. And while the conspirators trembled in their villas, one man walked straight into the chaos with absolute confidence. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend, his right-hand general. The man who had literally offered Caesar a crown just weeks earlier. Antony had been delayed that morning, some say by accident, some say on purpose. But the second he heard Caesar was dead, he didn't panic. He took control of the city. He made deals with the conspirators, he calmed the Senate. He pretended to be the adult in the room, but inside he was boiling, because Antony understood something the conspirators were too proud or too stupid to understand. You don't kill a man like Caesar and walk away. Caesar wasn't a king, he was a myth. And myths don't die, they explode. So Antony played along temporarily. He agreed not to punish the assassins. He agreed to preserve the Republic. He even shook hands with Brutus and Cassius. And they actually believed him. Meanwhile, hidden in a quiet villa far from the city, another player was getting ready to enter the game. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted son, his heir. His final surprise. Octavian was only 18. Skinny, sickly, zero military experience, a boy basically. But Caesar saw something in him, something the conspirators should have feared a lot more than Antony's anger. Because Octavian wasn't emotional. He wasn't loud. He didn't rage or threaten. He calculated. And when news of Caesar's murder reached him, he didn't cry, he didn't panic, he didn't hide. He whispered the sentence that would rewrite Rome forever. I will claim what is mine. Two men now stood in Caesar's shadow. Antony, the warrior, Octavian, the strategist, and the conspirators. They were now caught between them, fragile, divided, and suddenly realizing that stepping over a dead Caesar was much easier than dealing with the men who planned to avenge him. Meanwhile, Caesar's body still lay in the Forum, covered, ignored and silent. But that silence was temporary, because Mark Antony was about to drag Rome into the most explosive funeral speech in human history, a speech that would turn the entire city into a firestorm of rage. A speech that would make the crowd lose its mind. A speech that would make Caesar more powerful dead than alive. A speech that would make murder look like treason and revenge look like justice. And the moment Antony's voice echoed through the Forum, the conspirators finally realized they didn't kill a dictator. They created a martyr. The conspirators wanted a quiet funeral. Simple, respectful, controlled. They wanted Caesar to go into the ground peacefully, so they could move on without riots, without chaos, without the city remembering that the man they stabbed was loved far more than they were. So they handed the funeral over to Mark Antony, thinking he would behave, thinking he would keep things calm, thinking he was still playing the let's all be friends act. They were wrong. Horribly, catastrophically wrong. The Forum fills, and Antony prepares the trap. The Forum was packed. Senators, soldiers, merchants, bakers, slaves, every class of Rome. Tens of thousands of people shoulder to shoulder. At the center stood Caesar's body, bruised, blood-stained, stabbed 23 times. Antony approached slowly, calm, controlled. Not a general, not a politician, a grieving friend. The conspirators relaxed. Brutus nodded respectfully. Cassius actually smiled. That's how good Antony was. He didn't start with rage. He didn't start with accusations. He started with the softest, most disarming line in Roman history. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. And in that second, the crowd's heartbeat synced with his. They were his, fully. Färsinde finwanski kamma fäses tuachisa. Antony's strategy: destroy them without naming them. He praises Brutus. He calls the conspirators honorable men. He repeatedly says he doesn't want to stir trouble. Reverse psychology at world champion level. He manipulates the crowd by agreeing with the assassins and then methodically tearing their arguments apart. They said Caesar was ambitious. Antony reminds the crowd Caesar refused a crown 3 times. They said Caesar threatened Rome. Antony reminds the crowd Caesar gave them land, food, and reforms. They said Caesar wanted to be king. Antony reminds the crowd Caesar wept with the poor. The crowd shifts, first murmurs, then anger, then rising thunder. Brutus and Cassius start sweating. Färsinde finwanski kamma fäses tuachisa. Then Antony plays his MasterCard, the will. Antony pulls out a paper. A document. Caesar's will. He says Caesar left money to every Roman citizen. He says Caesar donated his gardens and estates to the public. He says Caesar loved them more than his own life. The crowd erupts into shock, rage, pain. They were told Caesar was a tyrant. Instead, he was their benefactor. Antony wasn't giving a speech anymore. He was lighting a fuse. Färsinde finwanski kamma fäses tuachisa. Then he shows them the body. Antony walks to the corpse. He leans down, and he lifts Caesar's torn, stabbed, shredded toga for all of Rome to see. Gasps, screams, cries. People covering their mouths. People collapsing. He shows them the stab wounds one by one. This was Brutus's cut. The crowd shatters. Brutus, Caesar's beloved friend, became the Judas of Rome instantly. Antony didn't need to accuse anyone. The wounds did it for him. Färsinde finwanski kamma fäses tuachisa. Rome loses its mind. The forum explodes into chaos. People begin grabbing stones, torches, anything. The conspirators realize they are not heroes. They are now the most hated men in the city. Brutus and Cassius flee for their lives. The crowd burns benches, carts, and shops. They grab Caesar's body, carry it into the streets, build a makeshift pyre, and set the city on fire with his funeral flames. Rome became a riot, a volcano, a war zone. Antony didn't just avenge Caesar. He weaponized Caesar's corpse to ignite a civil war. A war that would choke the Republic to death. A war that would decide the next ruler of the world. A war that would drag Rome straight into the claws of a new power. Octavian, the quiet air, the deadliest mind in the room. Rome was burning. Antony had unleashed chaos. Brutus and Cassius were fugitives, and the Republic was bleeding in the streets. And into this inferno walked a boy, thin, pale, barely 19. No army, no reputation, no power. His name was Gaius Octavius, but history would remember him as Augustus. Färsinde finwanski kamma fäses tuachisa. The heir nobody expected. Caesar's will didn't just leave money to the people. It named Octavian and his great-nephew as his adopted son and heir. That meant one thing. This teenager wasn't just family anymore. He was Caesar's son, and in Rome, bloodline was destiny. Antony thought he had hijacked Caesar's legacy with the funeral speech, but Octavian had something stronger than words. Legal inheritance, the name, the mantle, the divine aura of Caesar himself. Färsinde finwanski kamma fäses tuachisa. Octavian's first move: enter Rome quietly. He didn't storm in with soldiers. He didn't shout or threaten. He walked into Rome quietly, almost invisibly, a boy among giants, but every step was calculated. He visited Caesar's veterans. He showed them the will. He reminded them, Caesar chose me. And the veterans, hardened killers who had followed Caesar across continents, began to whisper, then nod, then pledge. Antony had the crowd. Octavian was building an army. Outsmarting Antony. Antony thought Octavian would be easy to crush. A teenager. Untrained. Naive. But Octavian played the long game. He flattered Antony in public. He pretended to be his ally. He let Antony think he was in control. Meanwhile, Octavian was bribing senators, recruiting soldiers, positioning himself as the true son of Caesar. Antony had charisma. Octavian had cold surgical strategy, and strategy always wins the war of time. Hijacking Caesar's legacy. Octavian understood something Antony didn't. Caesar wasn't just a man anymore. He was a myth, a god in the making. Octavian wrapped himself in that myth. He called himself Divi Filius, son of the divine. He printed coins with Caesar's face beside his own. He made every speech about loyalty to Caesar's memory. Antony was Caesar's friend. Octavian was Caesar's blood. And in Rome, blood eclipsed friendship. From nobody to master of Rome. Within months, Octavian transformed. No longer the pale teenager. No longer the quiet heir. He was commander of Caesar's veterans. He was the darling of the Senate. He was the living embodiment of Caesar's will. Antony had lit the fire. Octavian stepped into the flames and claimed them. The Republic wasn't dying because of Antony's speech. It was dying because Octavian was turning Caesar's ghost into a throne. And soon the boy would sit on it. Not as Octavian, not as Caesar's heir, but as Augustus and the first emperor of Rome. Rome wasn't just divided. It was split down the middle. 2 men, 2 visions, 2 heirs of Caesar. Mark Antony, the fiery general, Caesar's right hand, master of the crowd. Octavian, the cold strategist, Caesar's adopted son, master of patience. They pretended to be allies. They even formed the second triumvirate with Lepidus, carving up Rome like a butcher's table. But everyone knew this was temporary. Only one man could rule the empire. The alliance of necessity. At first, Antony and Octavian needed each other. Brutus and Cassius were still alive, raising armies in the east. So Antony and Octavian joined forces. Together, they crushed the assassins at Philippi. Brutus fell on his sword. Cassius died in despair. The Republic's last defenders were gone. Rome belonged to Caesar's heirs. But once the common enemy was dead, the alliance began to rot. Antony's fatal mistake. Antony went east, chasing glory, chasing Cleopatra. He fell in love with her, gave her land, treasures, even Roman provinces. To Rome, it looked like betrayal. Antony wasn't just a general anymore. He was a man seduced by a foreign queen. Octavian seized the moment. He plastered Rome with propaganda. Antony was abandoning Rome. Antony was enslaved by Cleopatra. Antony was betraying Caesar's legacy. And Octavian, the son of the divine, became the defender of Rome's honor. The war for the world. The Senate split. The army split. The people split. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces in Egypt. Octavian rallied Rome behind him. The clash came at Actium, a naval battle that would decide the fate of the empire. Antony's fleet was massive. Cleopatra's ships glittered with gold. But Octavian had patience, discipline, and Agrippa, his brilliant admiral. The battle turned. Cleopatra fled. Antony followed. Their armies collapsed. Rome belonged to Octavian. The end of Antony and the birth of Augustus. Antony and Cleopatra died in Egypt, lovers undone by ambition and betrayal. Octavian returned to Rome not as a boy, not as a rival, but as the undisputed master of the world. He didn't call himself king. He didn't call himself dictator. He called himself princeps, first citizen, a humble mask for absolute power. The Republic was dead. The Empire was born. And Octavian, now Augustus, became the first emperor of Rome. Epilogue, From Ashes to Empire. It began with daggers in the Senate. It ended with a crown disguised as humility. Antony lit the fire. Octavian walked through the smoke. And when the flames cleared, only one figure stood. The teenager who stole an empire. The man who turned Caesar's ghost into a throne. The ruler who would shape Rome for centuries. Augustus, the boy who became the empire.